I would like to begin by introducing the members of your panel this evening. I am to be something called a participating chair. I know what it is to chair, I know what it is to participate in a panel discussion, but to be a participating chair, well, I guess I'm going to learn tonight. My name's Bernadette Tobin. I'm in the School of Philosophy at Australian Catholic University, but I work at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, and I've been a colleague, indeed a friend of Ray's for about 20 years. Ray and I first spoke on air on Radio National. He was in Melbourne and I was in Sydney, so here we go again, Ray. On my close left here is Asma Barlas. Asma is a distinguished scholar and an outspoken and esteemed public intellectual, recognised as such in Europe and the US. She's written and spoken eloquently against Western misreadings of the Quran and passionately against Islamic misreadings that would appear to justify the oppression of women. Asma was born in Pakistan. She was educated at a Catholic school there, and I'm very amused that she told me that she now has a Catholic sense of guilt. Asma is a professor of politics and director of the Centre for Culture, Race and Ethnicity at Ithaca College in New York. So welcome, Asma.
Thank you.
And then beside Asma is Susan Neiman. Now I've scribbled all over what's officially written, Susan, so I'll have to just say that Susan is at the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin. At the interface of Eastern and Western Europe, it's one of Europe's most important centres of intellectual and cultural innovation outside the university framework. Susan was born in Atlanta, Georgia, studied at Harvard, taught philosophy at Tel Aviv University and at Yale University. 7 years ago, Ray invited her to give the Simone Weil lectures here at Australian Catholic University, and they turned into a part of her most recent book, a wonderful book called Moral Clarity. Susan's written about 5 books and she's working on 2 now, one of which is a novel. So welcome, Susan. And then lastly, Scott Stevens. Now I have to tell you that I did a little bit of homework on each of my co-panellists, and I got a very nice thing off Wikipedia about Scott Stevens, and I found that he's a very experienced producer of television programs, rom-coms, in the States. In particular, he worked on The West Wing and a couple of other well-known ones like that. I found that I could see nothing in this account of Scott's background that would be relevant tonight. Well, I apologise to Scott. It was a different Scott Stevens. So Scott is the religion and ethics editor for ABC Online. I don't know if you have been to ABC Online. It really is first class in that kind of genre. He is the editor-translator of the selected writings of the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and he's currently working on books with the theologian John Milbank and the literary critic James Wood. He's a regular commentator on the ABC's Radio National and ABC TV. So, welcome to Scott. So we'll start this part of tonight's occasion by each of the members of the panel responding to some aspect of what Ray has said tonight. Ray offered the promise that the members of the panel would help to clarify the denser parts of his work, the denser parts of his lectures. So that's the promise. Let's see how we go. Susan, we might begin with you.
Clarify. Whether Ray will take this as clarification or not, I'm not certain. Ray, when you began your talk, you mentioned the email you wrote to me saying you were glad that I was coming because you were beginning to worry you'd feel lonely with all these secular people. You didn't quote my reply, which was to say, I hope I won't disappoint you because I'm not sure I count as secular. But after hearing your talk, and more importantly, I'm still under the spell of this marvelous book, After Romulus. I'm assuming probably everybody in this room has read Romulus, which I also read about 7 years ago. But I was even more bowled over by After Romulus. After the talk, after reading this book yesterday on the plane down here, I don't understand any sense in which you want to say that you're not religious. And I'd like to try to say a little bit about it in as coherent a way as I can, being on the other side of the world and stuff. Because I actually think that one of the most interesting and important things about your work is that it really asks the question what it means to be religious. One of the things I like about your work as a philosopher, Ray is one of the few philosophers in the world who even uses the expression tone, a subject that we're taught, or a word that we're taught isn't supposed to be relevant to what we do. You also used in this talk the expression to speak in the wrong key. One of the things it reminds me of is Max Weber's phrase, religiously musical or religiously unmusical. I think both of us can agree that whatever else we are both religiously musical. You claim Bach as the person you learn the most from. And the interesting thing that Weber did when he talks about being religiously unmusical or musical, which I just looked up in preparation for my own talk on Saturday, and it made me appreciate Weber in a way that I normally don't. I mean, I did important stuff, but I find him quite hard to develop any sympathy for. He said, I myself am religiously unmusical, but it makes me a cripple. Okay? Once again, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say to you as you were speaking, I thought, gosh, we don't talk about faith very often. That is certainly not in the secular public intellectual sphere. It's really much easier, or in private, it's much easier to talk about, your children or your parents or your love affairs or any of those things. It's off, the topic is pretty much off limits. Partly because of what you splendidly suggested should be called against urbanity. But I feel called upon or able to do it because Ray has taken this extraordinary step of writing about his own life and his own parents in a way that is really quite breathtaking, that someone would have the courage to make themselves vulnerable in that sort of way. And as I was thinking about your doing that, and then thinking, well, you talk about Augustine and Kierkegaard as being people you have learned from. Not two people high on my list, interestingly enough, at all. I have real problems with both of them, maybe because I have fewer problems with reason than you do. But it then seems interesting or important to ask you, if you talk about tone, if you talk about form not being separable from content, and all of, you mentioned there are other philosophers who talk about your work as being religious. Well, if you're full of religious form, why is the content so important? once again, you end after Romulus by talking about life as a gift, which is something that resonates with me a lot, and I've written a little bit about it myself. Now, if one thinks about life that way, which I truly think is something that's core to what I would call a religious attitude, well, there doesn't have to be a giver in a sense that one can specify. Things are a little easier for me because I'm a Kantian, and I so think we don't have to set this stuff out exactly. But there sort of does have to be a giver, and one may not be required to say any more than that. And I just want to end by asking if your reluctance to call yourself religious isn't connected to the reluctance of, he was just mentioned recently, my friend James Wood, the literary critic. I don't know if you know him, but you must meet. You have very similar sensibilities and very similar concerns and a sense of great moral seriousness. I think for James, there's almost something blasphemous about calling himself religious. It's a move that he doesn't feel morally able to take, although, unlike you, he grew up in a very religious household. But I wonder if what's stopping you from taking this leap of faith, and I'm not asking you to leap into some particular faith, isn't a worry about being sacrilegious.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. Is this working? Yeah? Thank you, Susan, especially for the kind things you said about after Romulus. It reminds me of a time I was invited by a rabbi at the liberal synagogue to speak on the occasion of the celebration of the giving of the Ten Commandments. And I talked about love and also a bit about life as a gift. And I also said I'm not religious. And when I finished, I think it was the president of the synagogue said, "What? You're not religious? This is the most religious talk I've ever heard in my life." And then somebody else popped up and said, "What? You're not religious? What are you doing here? Trying to convert us all to atheism?" And then the rabbi had to pop up and say, "Well, he invited me." So I get this. I don't think, well, I'm not sure whether you're saying you do have to say, if you think that life is a gift, that there was a giver, or whether not. I think not. I've elsewhere quoted a wonderful piece from Pablo Casals where he talks about getting up every morning, and has done for over 80 years, and playing some Bach on the piano. And he says that I think he describes it, well, here's a religious term, a benediction upon the house, and that it gives him a sense of the joy of being alive and the wonder of life. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful quotation. But I would say of it, it's written in the key of gratitude. And therefore, and that's enough for me. I don't have to ask further. Do you, in all intellectual seriousness, have to ask who gave the gift? But I'm very aware that there's a gap. I have no idea how big it is, between someone who speaks as I do, and you do, of life as a gift, and someone who speaks of it as God's gift. And I know that Simone Weil, who I admire very much, believes that a sort of sense of life as a gift mediated by a sense of the beauty of the world. She calls it a form of the implicit love of God. But again, I don't know what that distance is. In one way, she implies it's no distance. In another, I'd say for me, it's an infinite distance. Because, and this is just personal, my sense of religious, I have no inclination to pray. Not even when I'm...
Not even when you're feeling particularly grateful?
No. I mean, unless you want to call that itself a form of prayer. As I know, as someone who's speaking on Sunday, Bernadette Tobin wants to say that is a form of prayer. Well, it's not what I call praying. But I also want to say that I would naturally say I can't pray because I don't believe in God. But I wasn't being coy when I said I'm not sure what it is to believe in God. I certainly don't think my not being able to pray is anything like someone thinking it's pointless sending a letter to someone because they've discovered that person doesn't exist. And I don't want to talk much about this, but there is a sort of tradition from Wittgenstein which is worried about this, and I've absorbed some of that. But I don't have the confidence that some of the people in that tradition have about talking about what they call the grammar of religious language. For me, I feel I don't understand it. I really do mean that. And I'm happy to call that sort of love of the world, and also the kind of the wonder at the nun, which I think isn't on a continuum of natural goodness, for example, at all. You're not going to get there by any Aristotelian conception of flourishing or any of the virtues. If you have it, your sense of all those virtues is transformed, but there's no way up from it. I feel about that. I'm happy to call it a spiritual orientation. And if someone said to me, spiritual, that's such a weasel word, I'd say it's not a weasel word. I mean, think about the Casals thing, and if someone asked me, what does spiritual mean? I'd say, well, it can mean this.
Well, the problem is spiritual has been so Californiaized.
I know, but, and it may be, maybe it can't be recovered. I mean, this may be one of the words that have gone dead on us because of it. I'm not sure. But for me, there's just this enormous distance between where I am and where I think someone who prays, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Islam, where they are.
So since you talked about love of the world, which was going to be the title of one of Hannah Arendt's books, let me give you a quote you might not know from a letter of Arendt's to Jaspers, and I should have memorized it, but I haven't quite. But it goes like this. She says, I find in myself a childish trust in God, not faith, trust in God. And then she says, of course, one can't do anything at all with that except be grateful for it or glad of it, you know, and I just wonder if that's not a place one could...
But I could never say that.
You could, yeah, okay. It's easier for Jews.
Asma, would you like to comment on the question, which is not a psychological question, it's, I guess, a philosophical question about whether what Ray has said tonight is or does or doesn't show a religious sensibility?
I'm kind of curious why we want to push him towards a particular kind of faith. So I'm sitting here slightly baffled. And I'm thinking it's usually me being asked why I believe in God. It's a strange place to be, you know. Why do you believe in God? Why do you not believe in God? Why does your faith take this particular form rather than some other particular form? As if one could actually tell from the outside what form it particularly needs to take for a specific individual. So I'm just kind of going with the flow right now. It's like, okay, what's at stake for us to get Ray to say, this kind of believing is religious believing, and this kind of believing is spiritual believing. And why does the word religious, as compared to spirituality, carry more weight or more meaning? So, and I say that as someone who is an observant Muslim. I'm baffled.
me say a word to answer that? Because I really, at least in the linguistic framework that I work in, the word spiritual, is like scratching nails on a blackboard. It's just not one that I or anybody I care about would use, okay? So that's out for me.
Sure.
And, I mean, Ray, in much of his writings, talks about things being, too much bathos or too much. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, New Age spirituality has a bad rap.
Yeah. So it isn't that I'm trying to push Ray into any particular form of religion, but I'm baffled by his calling himself not religious. That was my...
I once saw a BBC program on the origins of the universe, and it went on for about 4 hours. I couldn't understand a word of most of it, but I was glued to the television set because I was so, I don't know what, I was going to say entranced, but it was deeper than that. These high-flying astrophysicists expressing their love of the beauty of the world. It was just really astonishing. And afterwards I reflected on a remark by Simone Weil, who said it's misleading to talk about the love of truth. We should instead talk about the spirit of truth in love. And I thought, what a wonderful way of describing what these high-flying astrophysicists were doing. This was a love of truth, which we talk about, or actually we don't much talk about it anymore, but people used to talk about it as just a fundamental aspect of an academic vocation. But it was a spirit of truth in love, and they were in love with the universe, or with the world, as I would more naturally put it. But I would be very reluctant. I mean, I agree with Asma. I'm not sure quite what's at stake here. But I would be very reluctant to say, therefore, they are religious people. But I wouldn't even, California notwithstanding, I'd be inclined to say this: if you want to know what the word spiritual can mean, look at this. If you want to know how it might be rescued, put in the right kind of context, with the right kinds of examples, then this is one of them.
Maybe what's at stake might be that for a person who doesn't believe in a certain kind of belief, you would do a damn good job of speaking about it. About belief itself and the structure. And I guess that's where the mystification is, that the language and maybe even the ethos or the spirituality, sort of like, that's the mystery. What is it that you're standing at the edge of?
Yeah, I certainly don't believe in spooks or spiritual substances. And I should say I'm not in the slightest bit inclined to say, as some people say, I'm not religious, but I believe there is something. I have not the slightest inclination to that at all. Unless they just mean, as sometimes they do mean, as a very fine writer, Australian writer Don Watson actually wrote recently in The Monthly, that they're resistant to reductionist accounts of human life, that they think that scientific explanation can't explain everything. Well, if they mean that, I'm happy enough, as long as they don't think that there is something, and then they suggest something spooky or something immaterial. I don't believe in any immaterial substance.
One small PS that I would add, about the spirituality, religion thing, I think my discomfort with it is that it seems to suggest that religion has no spirituality. And that's my problem with it, because there's some people, well, religion is here and spirituality is here. But, emptying religion out of spirituality is also a very strange move. So, although I'm also very critical of the New Agey folks, everyone's spiritual and we can all go into a sweat lodge, we can lodge and be spiritual and come out. But at the other end, it seems like, okay, spirituality is something everybody can claim, we don't know what it is. But within religion, there is no space for the spirit, for spirituality, for mysticism, for the ineffable, for the wondrous. And I think...
Scott then Stevens.
I'm beginning to feel that I'm probably the most materialistic person on this panel, though, because I mean, simply as someone who is, oh, dear God, I hate the term, but I'm a practicing Christian, if you'd like to put it that way. I actually find much of what's being talked about a little bit sort of difficult to recognize, both in terms of the practice of religion, but also in terms of its moral bearings. I mean, Ray brought up the relative popularity of Buddhism in the West earlier, and I think one of the issues here is precisely the same problem that we often have with spirituality, which is that it's so promiscuous. It can be co-opted by just about any program. It can be individuated and fetishized in such a way that you can join it to anything. So be spiritual while you buy your Starbucks and know that some of your proceeds are going to go to Amazonian rainforests or whatever. And I think in much the same way, the issue here isn't simply spiritualism or spirituality versus religion, but it's spirituality or it's religion that's allowed to be, I'll use the term again, that's allowed to be promiscuous. And I mean, this is one of the issues, it seems to me, with the practice of Western Buddhism, that it can so easily feed into different patterns of existing life. And I think what we're really missing here isn't simply the relationship between spirituality and religion, but the relationship between religion and obligation. The relationship between the way that one practices what one believes and the way that that itself gets tied up, gets dirty, gets even sticky with actual human relationships. And I suppose I'm keenly aware that I'm sitting between two eminent Kantians, but
I'm not a Kantian, I'm an anti-Kantian. He haunts me.
Yeah, okay, yes. Thank you. You see, for me, Hegel has always been far more determinative, because there is simply no practice of religion. There is no practice, there's no enfleshment of one's relationship with God that isn't immediately implicated in one's relationship to and one's obligations to other people. And this is why I actually thought the story of the nun that you told today was not just perhaps one of the most important things that you mentioned, but it also represents, I think, the most stinging rebuke to the way in which we've emptied out both spirituality, but also the way that we've emptied out the concept of morality itself. We feel far more morally attuned and morally engaged with things that don't touch us directly, that we don't have to get our hands sticky with. People who are involved with, social media often talk about it as slacktivism. You retweet something and automatically feel like you've done your bit to make the world a better place, but it's cost you exactly nothing. Or you follow a cause on Facebook.
Click, take action, click.
and what that actually does, if I can sort of borrow a phrase from my favorite theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he says what that sort of slacktivism does, this sort of emptied out, emaciated form of morality, I think it can go for spirituality as well. What it does is little more than make us feel better about our promiscuous and godless lives. In other words, it's actually a form of cheap penance. I feel bad because I spent too much on X, and so I'm going to donate to Y. So I think the issue here really is, does the practice of religion bring us into concrete, obliged, mutually accountable relationships with other people that we simply cannot run from, but rather we see their lives as being bound up in our own? Or is this something that we can simply practice as a way of making us feel better about the way that we otherwise live?
Well, I think the short answer is of course it does. I mean, entail those obligations. Or I sometimes think it's deeper than the concept of obligation, actually. So, and sometimes deeper than the concept of moral either. I've sometimes been impressed by Schopenhauer's remark that the problem of suicide is too deep for ethics. But leaving that aside, I mean, you're right. I mean, I took that example of the nun. By the way, my ear for the word moral is I certainly wouldn't want to say that she was a superlatively moral woman. So I would resist that. But I don't think we're in any serious disagreement. There are real. I quote Simone Weil, who said that who was deeply suspicious of any idea that one should act for the sake of, do things for the sake of God. She was always quoting a line from the Gospel of someone. Jesus says, "You fed me and did this," and they say, "When, Lord?" And she quotes that as an example of not doing something for the sake of God. And she says, when I hear someone speak or respond to the afflicted in a certain way, or hear someone speak, a victorious person speak of a vanquished army in a certain tone, then I know that this is the love of God. So someone who's been so important to me as her, of course I think that this has to show itself very concretely in how one behaves. But I certainly would resist suggesting that the fact that I'm inclined to use the word spiritual puts some distance between me and that thought. Certainly I don't think it's spiritualism. I remember, in fact, someone who first alerted me to the depth of Plato saying that a particular translator of the Phaedo makes Socrates seem like a hobnobber with 19th century spiritualists, and that seemed right. So, but in fact, I don't want to argue about these terms, and that if you're I certainly take it. If you're religious, then the command to love one's neighbour must be right at the centre, and that has to show itself.
I think what I'm hearing from this is the limits of reason in terms of being able to reason people into or out of faith and belief.
Well, I do want to say just this about reason. It's reason with a big R that I resist, because I really feel. I feel very deeply that there's an imperative to lucidity, but I just think the concept of reason with a big R distorts the modes of lucidity.
Oh, let's take it back, you know.
Well, Ray, let me. This might be drawing a long bow from reason with a big R, but you make a lot of the distinction between the God of the philosophers and the God of religion. Now, there's a tradition, certainly in Judaism and in Christianity, and I think in Islam, but I'd like Asma to correct me on that, where, well, let me put it this way, there's no such sharp distinction. When God explains himself, he says, "I am who am." When John talks of God, he talks of him as Logos. Now, I understand why you might speak with disdain for the God of the philosophers as in a sense not being worthy of worship, but there are ways of understanding God where he is worthy of worship as Logos, as not just the natural world, but the natural world and the realm of meaning.
I'm not sure how one. I suppose one reply. You suggested it right at the end that if you incorporate Logos into the realm of meaning, and if you take very seriously, as I do, the need for lucidity and the need for reflection and so on, then I'm not at all opposed to that. So what I'm critical of is that concept of God, which can be arrived at in what I call the tone-free zone, which is not in the realm of meaning, and it's not so much that God is not worthy of worship, it's unintelligible that you should worship. The concept of worship has no application there. there's no doubt that there is a tradition of philosophical thinking about God, which I think does aspire to a tone-free zone. And I think we often don't realise just how deep it goes in our culture to think that when we're moved by something, we just have to abstract a proposition suitable for a tone-free zone for assessment before we can honestly accept what we've been inclined to believe because we're moved. I think that goes really, really deep. And it shows itself in the way people talk about being emotional, etc., etc. That's what I'm resisting. But I don't in any way want to resist the need for reflection. And as I said in my talk, I think the distinction that Socrates urged upon us right so many years ago of the need to be persuaded legitimately rather than illegitimately is utterly fundamental. But I don't want to. I think that for all sorts of complex reasons, a very narrow conception of what it is to be persuaded legitimately is current. And I'm pretty sure that it's what, when there was a conference here, I don't know if a conference is the right word, it filled the whole tennis centre of some thousands of people celebrating reason. And when people talk about the need for reason in the public sphere and so on, it's often that conception of reason that is operative. But I don't want in any way to contrast I don't want anybody to take what I'm saying as it were yielding to an irrationalism or anything like that. I want to say, no, there's an imperative to be reflectively lucid. But we ought to have a much more generous conception of what that is. Not generous, adequate conception.
Yeah, I wanted to raise another line of questioning that's been bothering me, or striking me, both in regard to your talk and into after Romulus, and it goes back to the nun. And you speak very beautifully of not just the nun, but also your father's attitude to Vacek as people being able to be friends with people who were broken but not diminished, and in a way that goes way beyond a sort of the psychiatrist saying, yes, in an abstract sense, they all have inalienable human dignity. I can see that as a goal of goodness, though not one that I could ever attain. But my question is, how do you both do that and still portray the struggle for sanity as a goal one ought to strive for? You see the worry, right?
Yeah. Well, in fact, I can't remember if I've written this or not. I've certainly thought it often. I was very resistant to what were called humanistic movements in psychology. When I came across them in the 60s, because there was the insistence that someone called R.D. Laing was particularly insistent about this. Which was to say you can make sense here. It has its own kind of sense. And I always thought this was, unintentionally of course, doing the opposite of what they wanted, because seriously to have compassion for people who are losing their minds is to take that expression seriously, and to know how absolutely terrifying it is, because it's the only affliction that you can't take an attitude towards. I mean, if you're told you're going to die, you can try to gather yourself and see what to make of it. But if you fear you're losing your mind, you can't lose your mind to develop. And I saw this in my father's eyes when he went mad. And the utter struggle for that I understand. But of course, when you're in that point, there's nothing you can do to struggle, because anything you direct your will against is under a certain conception, and you don't know whether that's madness or not speaking to you. So you can't use, there's no effort of will you can make towards anything that counts as a lucid conception of what you should be doing, and so on. So I think it's an absolutely terrifying state, and I think that people, there are all sorts of ways in which we try to diminish the terror of this by talking about it as just an illness, etc., etc. And I think these are all very well-intentioned sort of things, but I think that in a way might backfire. And so I don't know what to say except to say that I've seen it in the nun, so I don't have to. It's not as though I want to argue myself to the position, but I've never known how to characterize fully what she does, what she revealed. Because if I say she revealed that even such people could be our equals, then I have no idea what our equals means to, except that she responded without condescension. So it's not an explanation of why she did. Ditto with full humanity. If I say she read, what's full humanity? No, well, even in these, I would say that about inalienable dignity, by the way, that for the most part it simply means to be able to respond to these people who've been so radically degraded. So I cut out a bit from my talk today, but the bit that I cut out was to say that Wittgenstein said very rightly that the hardest thing in philosophy is to know when to stop.
All right, well, Ray, we would like to open it up now to a wider discussion, but there's just one more question I would like to ask of my co-panelists, and that is I'd like to ask you, Asma. Ray said that what he talked about tonight has significance for public debates, public controversies, the considerations that are legitimately put forward in public controversies. I wonder, given your experience of teaching people about those kinds of issues, whether you have some comment to make on what Ray said tonight.
Yes, particularly when you were speaking about the realm of meaning making. You've read my paper anyway, so you know. The question that I've been struggling with for a long time is why for 1,400 years Muslims have never been included in that realm of meaning making as full human beings. Yeah, I just wondered why you thought that's the case.
Well, Asma, whilst Ray thinks,
yes.
Your answer to that?
You'll have to come on Saturday to hear me. And I can't say I have an answer, but been trying to take stabs at it for many years. To simply dismiss it as racism, which partly it is, but that doesn't really fully get to it. But the pathologizing, the demonization, the dehumanizing and the rehumanizing of Muslims is usually in the hands of, when it comes to public discourse. It's always Western people, it's usually white, and it's typically male, who will dehumanize but then also rehumanize. So in both cases, it's almost like we don't have a voice, we are not part of that public reason, and we are not part of that meaning making, and it baffles me as to why that's the case. Even here, I gave a short talk at the Melbourne Law School, and at least a couple of responses from the audience baffled me. I had no clue where they came from, what their intent was, except, I guess, to provoke in me some sense of embarrassment or to put me on the defensive. That had nothing to do with anything I had said. And that happens all the time, routinely. So, I'm just curious.
But I hope you don't think that what I was saying was...
No. But I mean, I'm fascinated by that argument, by the ethicality of that argument. And I'm just thinking, it's a wonderful, powerful, seductive, beautiful way to think. So then, what explains the Muslim location, or dislocation, or relocation, or expulsion from that space of meaning-making, you know, politically?
Well, I might just say on that reading a version of the paper you'll be giving on what is it, Saturday, really opened my eyes. Well, that's in part a comment on my terrible ignorance too. It's not just a tribute to your paper, but I know that when I edited a book called Muslims and Multiculturalism, and it was a response to the attack on multiculturalism that came some years, not too many years after the attack on the Twin Towers. I then thought that was a trumped-up affair, that it was really an expression of racist hostility to Muslims, rather than a worry about nobody worried about multiculturalism. Everybody thought it was a great success in this country. Why suddenly? And it was clear that it wasn't the Italians or the Greeks or anybody else. It was the Muslims. And it was also clear to me that if most Muslims were white, it wouldn't have been that way. But what I realised when reading your paper was just for how long and how deep the hostility to Islam has been. And it can't be explained simply by reference to something like race. So amongst other things, you must come to hear Asma on Saturday.
But I have just one small other follow-up. Of course, having listened to Larissa Brent at the law school last night, obviously I'm not suggesting that it's just Muslims, right? Because one of the more powerful points she made was that certain questions, ethical, constitutional, political, legal, never came up for Aboriginal people in this country either. So when I think about Muslims, I think about them as one instance of illustrating this broader tendency. And I don't want to leave out Aboriginal people in this country, or for example, in the country where I am now legally a citizen, which is the United States of America, like what happens there to Africans and Latinos and Native people, and even Asian Americans who are considered the model minority. So it's part of a larger, for lack of a better term, maybe pathology.
And if I can add, I had a look around at Asma's work on the web. Asma has a terrific website where lots and lots of her papers, long and short, are there for the reading. And this is the most lovely work, the most terrific ideas, beautifully and clearly expressed. So as well as coming on Saturday night, I do recommend Asma's own website. Now, we have come to that moment where we widen the discussion. And there are two people in the audience. I can't quite see because of the lights, but there's one person here with a mic and there's one person up the back with a mic. And I think the thing to do, if you'd like to ask a question, is to come and stand behind one or other of them. And then I will ask you just to tell us who you are, and then you can ask the question of whomsoever you choose. Good.
I didn't mean to be first. My name's Ian Robinson. I'm with Ray I think in that I call myself a spiritual atheist, although I share some of Sue's reservations about the word spiritual, but I can't think of a better one. The paper I gave at the dreaded Global Atheist Convention in 2010 was called Atheism as a Spiritual Path. And in that I argued that if you follow a spiritual path deeply enough and longly enough and fully respect truth and wisdom and the search for meaning and so on fully, then you will become an atheist. And my quarrel with religion is that religious people aren't spiritual enough. They haven't gone the last part of the journey and given up the gods that have been haunting them. To me, truth is sacred, and religion is a violation of the sacred. Comment.
Well, well, it's really nice to see you, because I remember you standing just like that when we were students at Melbourne. that was a nice sight. I can't see why you say that. I mean, because I know so many deeply religious people of whom I would never dream of saying that they don't care for the truth. And the people I mentioned, the writers I mentioned. And also I actually do think, as I sort of said, that people often talk about reason, don't really think about what reason is. I know that, let's say, in talking about public reason, that the issues that people feel religious people should be silent about sexuality and gay marriage and all that. I don't believe for a minute that where we are now about these issues, which for the most part I applaud, I mean, where we are now, I don't think we got there on a path lit by reason. I mean, if you take racism, for example, then I think, to come to see dignity in faces that all look alike to us, or to hear real anguish in someone's cry, which racists can't do, I don't think you come to that on a path lit by reason. And anyway, anybody who does care about reason, if that's anything relative at all like the conception I was being critical of, then if you think of many of the religious philosophers of religion and the very sophisticated arguments they put up, it strikes me as absurd to say that they lack a capacity for reason. I mean, most people who are critical of these wouldn't stand a show in a serious conflict of argument with some of these people. To give an example, it's on my mind because I mentioned it today on a radio program, but some people may know that I have written, Bernadette doesn't like this, but I'm going to say passionately, on behalf of gay marriage. But not long ago at Monash University, there was a rabbi who said certain things about homosexuality that prompted some people at Monash to suggest that he should no longer have, he was had an honorary position, to suggest he should no longer have library rights and all that, and all these things taken from him. And I was asked what I thought about it by someone, and there at Monash, and I said, look, he's a bit crude, to be sure, but if the essence of his position is argued by people like John Finnis, who's a very distinguished professor emeritus professor now of jurisprudence at Oxford, and by what's his name, Robert George at Princeton. And are you going to ask them to stop writing or to leave the university? It's just absurd. I mean, and if anybody reads people like George or reads people like Finnis, it's impossible not to be impressed by the rigour of their thinking. So I don't understand where people get this idea that if you really care for truth, you'll become an atheist. And I also don't understand why people think, it's a kind of conceit to think, that atheists are the ones who really face death, and so on. And you can only think that if you're not alive. Sorry to say this, Ian, but I feel like you can only think that if you're not alive to some of the religious writings. I would never say if someone makes them over. I wouldn't say, how can you condescend to these people and think that they lack the courage to face life as it really is?
Well, I want to be less generous. I find you very judgmental and moralizing in a way that I think atheists think religious people are. And I find a kind of a proselytizing element to what you said, which is, come on, be like me, otherwise you're not living the life that you need to live. That bothers me.
Just before we go to that one, Ray, can I just push you a little bit further on that? It would be a terrible shame, I think you'd agree, if what went on here over the next couple of days was entirely hermetically sealed off from what went on at the conference in Melbourne earlier this year of the new atheists. So what ought to be the connections? In what way should what goes on here be answerable to what went on there? I wasn't there, but I've read some of these people. In what way would you hope that some of the so-called new atheists would be interested in what goes on here?
They won't be.
Well, the only thing I can only more or less say what I've said, which is that I think that the sources of our very deep beliefs are often unknown to us or hard to fathom. I think one has to have a very simplistic view of life to think that the sources of our deepest beliefs could be made really transparent to one. I think I don't know. Sometimes I feel like saying, "Where do you live if you think that?" Or have you never read Freud? I mean, you can go, or what? You know. But there is a conception of reason, and I think it is the conception of reason that was being celebrated that assumes that, and I think that's just a mistake, and I think it's a consequence of not thinking about what reason is. There's a lot of talk about reason without thinking what it is. A lot of calls to reason without thinking about what it is. So that's partly why I gave the lecture tonight on the theme that I did. I confess I've never quite understood the new atheism, and I have a friend who is part of that, Thomas Pataki, who has written a book against religion. Of course, it really troubles me that we're losing such judgment in our culture that people could seriously argue for creationism and want it to be part of the school curriculum. It frightens me politically that we've lost that kind of judgment. But it frightens me just as much that we've got climate change denialism, which expresses the same, in my judgment, lack of judgment. So it's not... and as for the terrible things that can be done by religious fanatics, well, anybody who lived through the last century knows that you don't have to be religious to have a very deeply murderous impulse. It was probably the most blood-stained century, and for the most part it wasn't religious people who did the killing, or in the name of religion. So I've never understood quite what the proselytizing intends in the new atheist. I mean, I don't mind calling myself an atheist, though people will call me. I don't know. I mean, I say I don't believe in God. If that's what it is to be atheist, I'm not an atheist. Sorry, Susan.
Well, unless there's somebody waiting...
No, why don't you go first and then we'll...
Because I found myself really by accident several years ago at a conference of these people. I had been invited because it was supposed to be a conference, something like names like Reason and Enlightenment. And somebody thought, oh, you're into Reason and Enlightenment. And then I found myself with people like Dawkins and Harris and all these guys. I mean, I think the first thing to be said is they won't listen. There's nothing that Ray don't think, as moving and seductive as Ray can be, I don't think I think they're tone deaf there. I don't think they'll be able to hear him any more than a fundamentalist religious person is going to be open to the idea that another faith is possible and not the one true way. But I think that the reason is that Ray has put his finger on something tremendously important, and I understand why you didn't call these lectures against urbanity, because not everybody would. It wouldn't have been as clear as what you did call it. But I actually think one of the most, if not the most, invidious forces in the culture is not the sort of creationism but it's well, then you also described Rorty absolutely perfectly. Irony is a default position. There's a sense of embarrassment to be serious, and I think what Ray is doing, if I understand properly here, is trying to fight against that embarrassment. I don't think it'll help Dawkins, but...
That's a very nice thing, yes. Look, I think we have time just for one more question, and the person has been patiently waiting down the back there.
Oh, okay. Look, what I wanted to say really spins off from what you've just touched on. I find this panel really scary because you've talked about morality, you've talked about truth, spirituality, whether we're religious, whether we're atheistic. The important thing is to be good to one another. But the real problem is that you take these views and you put them on the political scene, and we just have to look at, for example, what's happening in the Middle East, and I think, oh my God, can't we just have a politics of kindness? Do we have to look for morality, because that's a recipe for guns raised? Do we have to look for justice, because that's another recipe for horror and vengeance and vindictiveness and racism? So nobody's mentioned kindness. Thank you.
He did mention love.
He mentioned compassion.
And love.
But I'd like to speak to that because it's an objection that I get all the time. My last book was called Moral Clarity, and it is the first and I'm sure the last time I ever took a phrase that was made famous by George W. Bush, whom I loathe. I mean, who I think should be in front of The Hague, okay? And I kept hearing from people with just the same concerns as you, saying, how can you possibly use the word evil because it's being used by Bush and bin Laden? How can you possibly talk about moral clarity? And my answer is, those are the most powerful words we have in our language. And if we refuse to use them, we will be leaving them in the wrong hands, in the hands of people who have no scruples. So that if we don't take them back, they will remain in the hands of the Bushes and the Al-Qaedas of the world. Kindness is great. I have no problem. I mean, I think it's a major virtue, okay? But it doesn't move people in the way that these other terms do.
Can I just say, I think one of the issues here, and you've put your finger on something very important, one of the issues is for so many of us today, morally speaking, we think that politics is the only game in town. But that's only because we've got a view of the world increasingly in the West, where there are individuals on the one hand, and there's the state on the other. I don't know if you've seen Laura Tingle's wonderful quarterly essay out this week, but she's actually putting her finger on precisely this, that so often, when it comes time to get something done, when it comes time to shape the world in the way that we think it ought to be, politics really is the only recourse. But we only can think about that if we have fundamentally an emaciated view of what constitutes human life. Because politics is strictly speaking about coercion, I think that, in other words, a specific form of power, What we're missing here, and I think this is what Ray was touching on in many beautiful ways, what we're missing here is the very network of human relationships between the individual. It's more than the individual, but it's far less than the state, precisely because it's non-coercive. In other words, I mean, so much of the way that we live today, it seems to me, is as if society doesn't exist, or as if things like Twitter and Facebook were an adequate, ersatz, a surrogate for society. And the thing that we're most, I realize I'm using a lot of we's here, and I'm happy to defend that, but the thing that we're most reluctant to do is in some ways to allow our lives to become obliged to the life of somebody else. So the very things, the very virtues that we're talking about, and the only context, it seems to me, within which an intelligible way of talking about good and evil can take place, is in the network of human relationships themselves. In other words, these things have to be predicates, if you like, of the exercising of patience. But because things have to happen much more quickly than we're prepared to allow them to do, and precisely because human relationship is so sticky and so messy and so difficult to sustain, because it costs us so much, and because it somehow compromises what we regard as autonomy, I think it primarily means that we just are not willing to take as much responsibility for things like kindness and virtue. And it means that fundamentally we keep throwing that back onto the government. Or we determine that it's just best if we leave one another alone, if we let out of, get ourselves out of one another's way. That's no way for society to be. That's certainly no way, it seems to me, for humans to live.
Now, look, what we're going to do now is just stop. We're going to stop because we're going to be going on over the next couple of days, and we truly are, as Ray said, in the middle of things. It seems to me that Susan said something a moment ago that captures very well what Ray has done for us tonight, what Ray has done by way of opening up a discussion, and that is, Susan talked about an embarrassment about seriousness. And what Ray has shown us tonight is that truly there's no need for such an embarrassment about seriousness, about religion, about religious seriousness. So I'd ask you to join with me in thanking Ray and my co-panellists, and we'll meet again tomorrow.